Hello, my name is Alvin Luedtke, and I'm a fire captain with the City of Yuma Fire Department. I wrote a thesis entitled Bridging the Gap, Instilling Moral Courage and Impelling Moral Action in the Public Safety Sphere. I came into the master's program at CHDS knowing that I wanted to examine moral behavior in a public safety context, and more specifically to examine how recurrent instances of moral failure continue to occur in professions predicated on courage and public service. After all, few things undermine the public trust and legitimacy of public safety organizations quite like moral failure and unethical conduct. One of the things that I endeavored to do with my research was to examine moral failure in a holistic way. All too often, organizations experience moral failure and are quick to assign blame onto the perpetrator without examining the circumstances that led to that event. Recognizing the complexity associated with my research questions, I decided to use a relational developmental systems, or RDS, framework to guide my efforts. RDS asserts a fixed relationship between the individual and the context in which both define and are defined by each other. More importantly, RDS seeks to identify conditions over causes, which, given the diverse and infinite arrangement of factors, was highly appropriate. For my thesis, I divided context into three dimensions, and that was the team, organizational, and situational, while also examining individual determinants of moral behavior. Due to data availability, I chose to focus on moral behavior within the law enforcement profession. And to do that, I focused on three case studies. That was the LAPD's Rampart crash scandal, the Baltimore Police Department's gun trace task force scandal, and the death of George Floyd. And these constituted tangible examples to really test the theoretical assertions that I was making in my thesis. Within the individual dimension, I found that three classifications of traits drive moral behavior, and these are agentic, dispositional, and conditional characteristics of individual officers. So agency involves officers seeing themselves as capable moral actors with the ability and responsibility to act in advancement of moral outcomes. Disposition is how officers view and conceive interactions with members of the public. And meanwhile, conditional factors relate to the physical and emotional state of the officer, with burnout, fear, and anger acting as barriers to the genesis of moral behavior. I found the team context communicates and solidifies the normative culture of an agency, and in turn outlines the norms and expectations to junior officers. This occurs through referent others, such as veteran officers and FTOs, and they influence junior officers' understandings of their moral obligations. This influence is often exercised through the use of rewards and sanctions like acceptance, ostracism, and other reputational consequences. Notably, the in extremis context of law enforcement fosters significant bonds of team loyalty that can ultimately create a conflict when police officers must choose between peer allegiance and the exercise of moral behavior. At the organizational level, I examined the values, training, policy, and accountability practices of law enforcement organizations. I found that law enforcement organizations often have discordance between their explicit or stated values and their implicit values that are communicated by the processes and the normative culture that exists at the agency. Such conflict leads to cynicism and deference to team members in establishing appropriate behaviors. I also found that the training of law enforcement agencies inadequately prepares officers to respond to moral challenges. In terms of accountability, I found that many of the accountability processes are blame-centric and do little to meaningfully identify the multitude of contributing conditions surrounding moral failure. In the situational context, the salience and vividness of a moral issue determines the extent to which officers perceive it as such. In addition, time pressure can lead to diminished performance and increased reliance on teammates for ethical decision-making. Lastly, how officers appraise the urgency and consequences that are associated with a moral issue heavily influence whether and how they choose to engage it. So after looking at these dimensions, I synthesized them into a process relational paradigm that described their interactions with each other. From this, I had three significant findings. The first is that value consistency promotes moral competency. Essentially, when organization and team values align and are expressed in the processes and normative climate, they are more likely to be expressed by individual officers. However, when they conflict, officers are more likely to defer to their normative culture that's expressed by the team. My second finding was that an elusiveness of ownership and a preference for disengagement exists across the law enforcement enterprise. When moral failure occurs, the individual, team, and organizational dimensions often attribute blame and displace responsibility for acting onto each other. They often fail to acknowledge and own their own respective contribution to the failure, which inhibits meaningful accountability and reform. And my final finding was the power of essentially the 3 S's of salience, socialization, and self-efficacy. In essence, officers must have issue and expectation salience to correctly understand the moral dimensions to a situation and the behaviors expected in response to its moral imperatives. They must also be socialized into an environment that promotes moral values as paramount. Finally, officers must see themselves as moral actors and believe in their capacities to bring about moral outcomes. Collectively, these 3 elements are important in having officers know what is right, desire to do what is right, and act in advancement of what is right. I make 3 recommendations from my research. First, law enforcement agencies should integrate ethics training throughout their training environment instead of isolating it to a particular class or block. Moreover, officers should encounter realistic ethical challenges within training that require them to think, to judge, and to act in response. Instead of just teaching officers how to practically implement their training, field training officers can be leveraged to socialize new officers into the moral role and responsibilities inherent to the profession. Because of its position in the team and normative environment, this could serve as a powerful vector to instill organizational values and expectations. Lastly, I recommend the adoption of a just culture approach towards ethical accountability. A just culture examines the circumstances surrounding a failure, providing a more holistic examination of the contributing components to an instance of moral failure. While I wrote this thesis describing moral behavior in law enforcement, my belief is that this research is relevant to the public safety enterprise at large. The fire and emergency medical services operate in decidedly similar contexts and share many of the same challenges. My hope is that this body of research expands decision-makers' understandings of moral behavior and leads to effective strategies to instill moral courage and impel moral action. Thank you for watching.